You can't come tonight, Eleanor. Mason stood in the doorway of our penthouse, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror. The developers, they expect a certain polish, a certain aesthetic. He didn't even look at me. He was talking about my building, the Zenith, 85 stories of steel and glass that I had designed. But to him, I was just the wife who didn't fit the image. Fine, I said. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just packed a bag and drove north to the lake house. As the sun set over the frozen water, my phone lit up. Dozens of messages from investors. And something had gone terribly wrong. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. People always ask, why did you stay? Why did you let him take the credit for 3 years? The answer is simple. You don't notice you are boiling when the temperature rises 1 degree at a time. Started small. Mason was the face, and I was the talent. Seemed like a fair trade. He loved the cameras and I loved the drafting table. I remember the night we won the Pritzker bid. I had been awake for 48 hours straight, my hand cramping around the stylus, my back screaming in protest. I was covered in graphite and coffee stains, shivering in the drafty back room of our old studio. Mason came in, smelling like expensive scotch and cologne. He had just come from a dinner with the board. He kissed my forehead and said, "We did it, Elle. You are the best support system a man could ask for." Support system. Not partner. Not architect. Support system. Like a beam hidden behind the drywall. His parents, Angela and Mark, were the ones who really cemented the dynamic. They would come over for Sunday brunch, look at my dark circles and my messy bun, and say things like, "Oh, Eleanor, you are so lucky Mason takes care of the business side. You're just too fragile for that world." They framed my erasure as protection. They made me feel like my invisibility was a gift. They normalized the silence until I forgot I even had a voice. I spent 3 years ghostwriting his career, designing skyscrapers I wasn't allowed to enter, solving structural problems he couldn't even understand. I told myself it was enough to see my work built. I told myself I didn't need the applause. But standing in that penthouse doorway, watching him check his reflection, watching him dismiss me from the biggest night of our lives, I realized the water was finally boiling. And I was done burning. The tires crunched over the fresh snow. Northern Michigan in February is a frozen hellscape, but to me it looked like sanctuary. The lake house sat alone at the end of a long, winding driveway that hadn't been plowed in weeks. Perfect. Let them try to find me here. I stepped out of the car, the biting wind stinging my cheeks, grounding me. The silence was absolute. No city noise. No demands. No Mason practicing his charming laugh in the mirror. Just the wind and the ice. Inside, the air was stale and cold. I didn't turn on the heat. Kept my coat on. I sat at the kitchen island, the marble cold against my fingertips, and stared at the black rectangle of my phone. It was buzzing rhythmically against the wood. Mason. Angela. Mark. The unholy trinity of my erasure. I flipped it over. A text from Mason flashed on the screen. "Where are you? The pre-show is starting. I need the login for the holographic rendering." I stared at those words. You need. That was the summary of our entire marriage. He needed and I gave. He took and I replenished. Old Eleanor would have sent the password. Old Eleanor would have apologized for being difficult. Old Eleanor would have fixed it to save him from the embarrassment of his own incompetence. But old Eleanor died the moment he looked in that mirror and told me I wasn't polished enough for the world I built. I didn't reply. I pressed the power button and held it down until the screen went black. The darkness was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Then I opened my laptop. The blue light washed over my hands. My hands, which had drawn every line, calculated every load, dreamed every curve of the Zenith. I logged into the central server. The interface greeted me. "Welcome, administrator." I navigated to the active project files. The Zenith Grand Opening Presentation. Status Live. User Mason. I watched the cursor hover over his name. Felt heavy like pulling a trigger. I clicked Edit Permissions. Menu drop-down. I selected Revoke Administrator Access. Then I went a step further. I initiated the Intellectual Property Lockdown Protocol. Feature I had coded myself for security breaches. The screen blinked once. Access denied. A red padlock icon appeared next to Mason's name. The entire cloud server containing the blueprints, the holographic renders, the structural data, and the speech notes I had written for him, locked down instantly. It was done. I wasn't just leaving him. I was taking my brain with me. I sat back in the cold, dark room and waited for the scream that I knew was happening 400 miles away. 400 miles away. The lights were dimming in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Chicago. I poured myself a glass of cheap wine and watched the digital clock on the microwave. 15. Right now, Mason was stepping onto the stage. I could picture it perfectly. The thunderous applause. The $800 million of investment capital sitting in the audience, waiting to be dazzled. He would be wearing the midnight blue tuxedo I picked out for him. He would be flashing that charming empty smile that had fooled me for 3 years. He would reach for the tablet embedded in the podium. He would tap the icon labeled the Zenith walkthrough. And then the world would stop. Because instead of the beautiful rotating hologram of the 85th floor atrium, a red box was flashing on the massive screen behind him. Access denied. Unauthorized user. Intellectual property rights locked. I didn't need to be there to feel the silence that followed. It was the kind of silence that sucks the air out of a room. Mason didn't know the structural load coefficients. He didn't know the wind resistance metrics for the upper spire. He didn't even know the square footage of the lobby. I knew this because I had tried to teach him and he had waved me off saying, "Babe, that is boring nerd stuff. I sell the dream. You handle the math." Well, the math was currently locked behind a 256-bit encryption key, and the dream was evaporating. My phone buzzed against the granite counter. It was the first crack in the dam. A voicemail from Angela. I let it play on speaker, her voice shrill and tinny in the cold kitchen. "Eleanor, pick up the phone. There is a technical glitch. Mason is up there looking like an idiot. Fix it." I took a sip of wine. The entitlement was breathtaking. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask where I was. She just commanded like I was a malfunctioning appliance. 10 minutes later the tone shifted. Mark left a message. "Eleanor, this is not funny. We have investors from Dubai in the front row. If you do not unlock those files immediately, we will sue you for corporate sabotage. Do you hear me? We will ruin you." I laughed out loud. The sound was sharp and jagged in the empty house. Sue me. For protecting my own copyright. For refusing to let a man who couldn't draw a straight line present my life's work as his own. Good luck with that. Then came the text from Mason. It was a single line, typed in all caps. "Please, help me." I imagined him standing there, sweating under the stage lights, trying to ad-lib. Trying to explain the complex biophilic ventilation system using only buzzwords like synergy and dynamic flow. He would be stuttering. He would be looking for me in the wings, but I was gone. And the people in that room, the sharks who smelled blood in the water, were starting to realize that the king wasn't just naked. He was hollow. There is a specific kind of silence that happens before an avalanche. It is the sound of a structure groaning under weight it was never meant to hold. I watched the live stream on my laptop, the screen illuminating the dark kitchen. Mason was chuckling nervously into the microphone. He loosened his tie. He ran a hand through his perfect hair. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. His voice cracking just slightly. "It seems we are experiencing a minor technical hiccup. The server is sensitive tonight." He tried to flash that $1 million smile, but it looked like a rictus of terror. He tapped the podium. "My team is handling it as we speak. We will have the renders up in a moment." He was lying. There was no team handling it. There was just me, 400 miles away, sipping wine and watching him drown. And then movement in the front row. Amelia stood up. Amelia. The real estate mogul who had flown in from New York specifically for this reveal. She didn't look angry. She looked bored. She held a microphone that a runner had scrambled to give her. The room went deadly quiet. Mason looked relieved for a split second, thinking she was going to offer a lifeline. He was wrong. "Mason," she said, her voice amplifying through the ballroom speakers. "Forget the hologram. You are the visionary, right? You have the design in your head. Just walk us through the load-bearing ratios for the cantilevered terrace on the 40th floor. We have been hearing rumors about shear stress in high winds. Clarify the math for us." It was the kill shot. A simple, specific structural question. The kind of question any first-year architecture student could answer about their own design. The kind of question I had answered for him in private rehearsals a dozen times. But Mason hadn't listened. He had been too busy checking his reflection. He froze. He blinked. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. He looked like a deer in the headlights of an oncoming semi-truck. Well, Amelia," he stammered. The ratios are dynamic. They are within standard safety tolerances." Amelia didn't sit down. She remained standing, a pillar of judgment in a Dior suit. "Standard tolerances," she repeated. "This building is built on a fault line, Mason. Standard tolerances would mean a collapse within 5 years." She turned to face the crowd, then looked back at him. "You don't know, do you?" Mason's face went gray. "My team handles the specific calculations," he whispered, leaning into the mic. "No," Amelia said, and her voice was like a gavel coming down. "Your team didn't design this. Eleanor did." The gasp in the room was audible even through my laptop speakers. Amelia pulled a document from her clutch. "I did my due diligence, Mason. I checked the filing for the LEED certification. It requires the signature of the lead architect. A licensed architect. You aren't licensed, Mason. You are a frontman. And the signature on these documents belongs to Eleanor." She held up the paper. The cameras flashed, a strobe light of humiliation. "This design, this intellectual property belongs to your wife. The wife you banned from this building tonight. So, unless you can produce her signature right now, this project is dead in the water. Because I am not pouring $85 million into a building that is legally essentially a stolen concept art." She dropped the microphone on the table. It made a dull thud that sounded like a coffin closing. Then she turned and walked out. The spell broke. The room erupted. Reporters were shouting questions. Investors were pulling out their phones. Mason stood alone on that massive stage, small and shrinking, stripping naked in front of the world he desperately wanted to impress. Closed my laptop. The avalanche had fallen. And the silence that followed was perfect. The exodus was immediate. It wasn't a slow trickle. It was a dam breaking. I watched on my screen as $800 million of potential capital stood up and walked toward the exit signs. They didn't look back. The reporters were already typing, their thumbs moving like blurring pistons. The headlines were writing themselves. The Zenith. A skyscraper built on fraud. Celebrity architect exposed as fake. Mason stood frozen on stage. The access denied screen glowing red behind him like a warning flare. He looked small. That was the first thing I noticed. Without my designs to prop him up, without my words in his mouth, without the armor of the genius label I had crafted for him. He was just a man in a rented tuxedo standing in an empty room. The collapse came with brutal clarity. By Monday morning the firm's valuation had fallen 60%. By Wednesday the lawsuits arrived. Fraud, misrepresentation, breach of contract. The developers shut down the Zenith. They wouldn't build a monument to a liar. $800 million didn't leave. It vanished, taking Mason's reputation with it. Angela and Mark tried to control the story. At their country club they were ready to blame a hysterical wife and a technical glitch. But the doors were closed to them. Social status is a market too, and theirs had crashed. They weren't the parents of a prodigy anymore. They were the people who enabled a con. Word was they were quietly removed from the spring gala. Their exile was as loud as the silence that used to fill that ballroom. On Friday Mason called. answered Eleanor. His voice sounded shredded. Please. We can fix this. I can release a statement. Give you co-credit. Say it was a misunderstanding. I sat on the lake house deck watching a cardinal land on the snowy railing, red against white like a sharp decision. There is no we, Mason. I don't want co-credit. I want my name off your letterhead. I want a divorce. And I want you to sign the cease and desist my lawyer sent this morning. But without the designs, I have nothing. That was the truth he'd dodged for 3 years. In that moment I understood why his fall was so fast. Mason lived by having rather than being. He had the CEO title, the corner office, the suits, the parents who crowned him a king. But he never became an architect. He lacked the inner structure, the skill, discipline and hard hours to hold up the crown. He was a facade, solid only until the wind hit. I had been the steel. Once I stepped away, gravity took over. It wasn't revenge. It was physics. You can't cheat competence. I'm not rebuilding you, I said. You wanted the spotlight. Now you have it. I hung up, and the quiet that followed felt clean. 6 months later, a frosted glass door in a West Loop warehouse read, "The Foundry. My studio. My firm." Amelia walked in with coffee and a grin. We just won the Chicago Riverwalk expansion. Unanimous vote. Praise for the biophilic approach. I smiled, not the old frantic kind, but something rooted. We won because the design was solid, because the math worked, because I no longer hid behind a man who treated architecture like theater. I saw Mason once after that, selling beige tile in a showroom, charm thinning like cheap paint. I didn't stop. True indifference doesn't need an audience. I hadn't destroyed him. I'd simply stopped building him. I took my bricks back, and what followed was only gravity. Now in the Foundry, I draw new lines on fresh vellum. The name on the blueprint is mine.